There is something about a red Intense that will evoke fond memories for long-time fans of downhill. This bike is the product of a lot of testing, a slew of different iterative designs, and many miles under the brand's host of elite racers. The 6-link design and layout certainly looks very different, and is a huge departure from sleek, carbon, recent downhill bikes from the brand. When we look back at the last Intense downhill race bike, it would probably be the M29, which was sleek, it was carbon, and it was a great looking bike. This new M1 is fundamentally different. What are just some of the changes they put in place?
Well, you mentioned the new M1 is alloy, not carbon. Uses a 6-bar high pivot design, so it's quite complex, has an idler, and it also runs on mixed wheels now. So no 29, no option for that either.
Aaron Gwin has something like a history where he goes to a brand, he develops an amazing downhill bike, and then the second it's done, he goes to another brand. Now, is that what he's done with this bike? And testing it in Whistler, well, there was a lot to go on.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, this is an exciting bike. It's red, it's an Intense, it's alloy. You know, we were both pretty keen to jump on this, and it delivered.
Absolutely. But understanding how it did that is more than just about bolting an idler on a bike and calling it a day. This bike from the ground up is a very different proposition to many of the others on this field test. The M1 on paper isn't so different from another bike in this test, the Chisel Supreme. Both are idler equipped high pivots with 6 links, although interestingly Intense have backtracked on talk of this being a 6-bar. Both bikes also kick the carbon trend, and both have been developed on the racetrack. But to say they ride the same would not be true. What is it like to swing a leg over the Intense? So Matt, to hop on the Intense, just the stance you end up in, it kind of makes you feel invincible, straight from the off. What do you put that down to?
I mean, it definitely has a taller bar height, whether those geo figures were accurate or not. Definitely felt like a bit of a monster truck, hey?
Absolutely, it feels, I mean, looking at the geometry chart, it is lower in terms of its stack value than the Chisel, but it doesn't ride or feel like that. Now, there are other things at play there. You know, you've got maybe a stack in the stem, you've got handlebar rise, there's other things, and how the bike sits into its travel as well. But to get on this bike, it just feels like a monster truck. And for me, if I had to take a bike to ride the steepest, most challenging terrain, that would be the one I would be grabbing. When we look at the other bikes on test, most notably the Chisel Supreme, how do these bikes compare? Because from the outside, when you look at them on a spreadsheet, they look kind of similar, but they ride quite differently.
Yeah, you can tell by looking at the Intense, you know, taller bar height, longer front center, slacker head tube angle. There's a lot of bike ahead of you, would you say, like ahead of your feet?
Yeah, I'd say so. You feel really safe riding this. Whereas the Chisel feels maybe like a bit more of a live wire.
Yeah, a little lower, a little bit more glued to the ground. The Intense has some of those elements, but it's not quite as all-encompassing as, or like neutral as what the Chisel can do, hey?
Absolutely, it feels like your weight is sitting that bit more rearward. Now, when you get bikes that have, you know, a slightly higher front, and again, compared to some of the bikes on test, a slightly shorter rear end, that can give a really rearward weight bias, which can feel very safe, but it can be harder to push into turns. How did this Intense get on when we weren't just riding flat out tech with big chundery rocks and roots, but we actually wanted to do some precise cornering? What did you think of it?
I mean, it does take a little bit of sort of like awareness to weight the front end when you go into a flatter corner, just so you don't wash the front end. And again, the higher bar height, you have to lean into the bike a little bit more. And pumping through turns, you know, it has a shorter chainstay, but it's a high pivot as well. So it does have a little bit of that elastic feel as that chainstay length grows.
You'd have to commit to the front, but there is the grip there, should you be wanting it. But you do have to be a bit more aware of it. It's not the Chisel, which feels very, very planted on the front, or something like the YT or the Frameworks, which feel that bit steeper and a bit more sort of enduro bikey.
Yeah, not quite as intuitive as the other bikes.
Absolutely, you have to be a bit more aware. And I found that for me, coming into a turn, you kind of felt like you wanted to kind of push out the back to really get it through turns more than something you feel like you directly carve through. When it comes to riding flat out chunder though, does this all begin to make sense? Is it able to reap the rewards of having that rearward axle path with the neutral feet and the high front? Is it ultimately a fast bike when you think of flat out technical racetracks?
Yeah, I would say so. You feel very safe, confident to like attack things. Like I said, there's a lot of bike and front wheel ahead of you, and then the rear wheel tracks really well. Like even in the linear setting, which has a little bit more support, still kind of that rear wheel dances across stuff really well.
Yeah, I mean, going between the linear and the progress settings is really easy. And I think that's, the whole bike is just so open and easy to work on. I found for me, I thought the linear setting was really good. You got a lot of to push into, you got a bit more mid-stroke. But if you wanted something that's just like a real slugger to just take hits, that progressive setting is not only comfortable, but very confidence inspiring.
This bike is fast, confidence inspiring, and yep, very, very red. But what's it like to live with?
Okay, so you mentioned how open this bike is, and the frame specs. What do you mean by that? Like, it's easy to work on? Is the frame hardware solid?
Honestly, it is so easy to work on. Yeah. It feels like a real race bike in that sense. It is so open, it's easy to wash, everything drains out really easily. It's got kind of, you don't really see it from the side shot, but it's got like a big scissor swinging link, you know, coming across to drive that shock. This bike also has the TRP drivetrain. Now, I hadn't ridden TRP drivetrains before. This was the first time. They're not necessarily a fan of the mud. There was a bit of skipping. Obviously, anytime you get grit and dirt in your drivetrain, it can kind of reduce sort of functionality or performance. However, I was doing back-to-back with that SRAM 7-speed on the same day in the same conditions, and there was a lot of skipping coming out the TRP, and the SRAM seemed relatively happy. What did you think of the lever ergonomics?
Oh, yeah, I was actually going to touch on that. I
pretty rough.
Kind of missed them a few times, like didn't know where they were. It wasn't quite as intuitive, and yeah, they just don't have the same like kind of feedback or crispiness as the SRAM ones.
But also, it felt like they couldn't even get in a good place, but with their own brake lever.
Yeah.
It's like the two departments hadn't talked to each other. Like, you're making brakes? No way, we've got a drivetrain. They put it together, and it's like, oh, if we angle this an extreme angle, and then it all felt a bit unrefined.
A little bit.
What did you think of other elements of the spec? I mean, obviously, we've got good wheels from DT, we've got Fox suspension. Was there anything that stuck out to you for good or for bad that you really liked?
I mean, it does have a house brand stem and carbon bar, which, you know, to be fair, they're clean looking. Does have nice adjustment from 45 to 50 mils if you want that. And the touch points, ODI grips, can't really knock those. SDG I-beam seat, not my favorite.
Apart from that, the spec from head to toe was all around pretty good.
A solid spec then, even if the TRP drivetrain feels, well, quite a bit jankier than some of the more refined options on the market. Who is this bike for?
Okay, so the Intense M1, prototyped years through the race team. Who is it for now?
I think it's for me.
Yeah.
It's really, I loved this bike. I thought it was absolutely great. I'm kind of torn though.
Okay, explain.
My heart is the Intense, but when it actually comes to riding, I think the Commencal is a slightly better bike. It's a bit more weighted on the front, but for somebody that just wants, like I do, to ride fast, sort of natural feeling tech trails, some quite steep committing features, this is a bike you just feel so safe and you just feel so ready and encouraged to push on. And that's it's kind of a nice feeling.
Yeah, it's a downhill bike. You want to go fast, you want to rip technical tracks, but for jumping, it wasn't like lethargic, it just took a little bit more effort based on where the bars and like the length of the front center of the bike and the growing rear axle or chainstay length. It was better at going flat out down rough stuff than it was at jumping.
Absolutely. And I don't imagine that Intense made this to be a park rat bike.
Totally.
And fair enough, it definitely isn't.
A capable bike for any rider. But where does this bike excel?
When it comes to the strengths and weaknesses of the Intense, let's start with the things it does less well. And I would say this isn't a bike that thrives on flatter tracks. That's not in the way that it generates speed. It's not a particularly poppy or pumpy bike. Similarly, there are a lot of the key geometry figures which really put your weight rearward, which makes it very safe when you're riding steep terrain, but maybe not the most responsive on flatter terrain.
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it. You get this thing up to speed, or you point it down something really steep and nasty, and the bike's gonna eat all that up. But when you try and accelerate rollers or like pumping like jump trails, it's a little bit slower to respond to. It'll do it, it just requires a bit more effort, hey?
So what's this bike best at then? What's it for?
Definitely for rough downhill tracks. Plain and simple. It remains very neutral under braking and just gives you that confidence that you can hit stuff harder and harder lap after lap.
It's also got loads of great features that would make it a pretty good race bike.
Yeah.
Full external routing, the open design. It just seems pretty easy to work on. That said, it does without integrated frame bumps, which seems a bit.
A slight miss, but pretty well thought out race bike.
What the Intense M1 offers in sheer confidence is quite amazing, even if it doesn't balance that confidence with the sheer precision that the Commencal Supreme does. On the roughest tracks, this bike is simply exceptional, and the high front and slightly shorter rear will shine on steeper sections. That said, for an all-rounder, it can feel a little sluggish on smoother sections of trail and lacks front-end grip on flatter turns. The M1 is a bike for your hardest descents, and something perhaps not for your relaxed bike park runs.